part of this conversation, especially given that the election is just around the corner. And, the idea about populism and democracy and the uncertainty that we're experiencing in terms of our democratic institutions and practices, I think is really important that we at least have a discourse about it. And also talk about some of the uncertainty of what the international system and what American foreign policy is going to be if President Trump continues on for his reelection for another 4 years, or what it might mean for America in a post-Trump American experience or American foreign policy. So those are some of the things that I'd like to talk about today. But before I do that, let me give you a little bit of background about myself. Most of my research and scholarship is focused on, as Nancy was saying, on post-conflict democratization, post-conflict state building in the Western Balkans, with a particular focus in Muslim majority countries in Kosovo and in Bosnia and Herzegovina. As a young grad student, every time I traveled to the region and was sort of learning about the scholarship in the area and talking to practitioners and scholars and civil society activists in the region, it always sort of gleamed on me that a lot of the discussion was how the Western Balkan countries, these countries making a transition from war to peace, from one party authoritarian state to multi-ethnic democracies, the idea that these countries were going to embrace human rights, the rule of law, free markets, and they were making these tumultuous transitions towards those end goals, which, these end goals are pretty much Western standards of development. And so that's the type of conversation that I was always having as a young grad student, that these countries, these former communist countries, whether it's in Central Eastern Europe or Southeastern Europe, Central Asia and other post-communist countries, that their goal was to sort of steer their political and economic systems towards the United States or Western Europe. But the more and more I've been thinking about it lately, it seems that our politics is actually gravitating towards their direction. The idea of ethnic nationalism, the politics of division, populism, demagoguery, the retreat of democratic norms. A lot of the stuff that I've just been observing here and within the American context, it seems more and more that we're sort of gravitating in that direction, where we have, the authoritarian strongman, the cult of personality. Those are things that, as a grad student and a young Ph.D. student, we always thought about those type of political styles or a style of politics as being something that was outside of the Western discourse. But increasingly, particularly with this administration, we're seeing a lot of those things. And so it's disconcerting, it's unsettling. And so I wanted to have a conversation about it. And what better way to do that than with this really wonderful lecture series and sort of discussing these issues with just people right before the election, a very important election at that. And so let me start off. I'm gonna share my screen. I'm gonna be a little academic here. I've got a PowerPoint presentation, so I know my students will probably, if my students are here, some of them have already seen this. I teach a class in populism, on global populism. I started getting into populism about several years ago, about 4 or 5 years ago. I started writing a paper with a colleague of mine in the sociology department, looking at Islamist forms of populism, particularly with Turkey, with President Tayyip Erdogan and his populist style politics and how that was affecting the Western Balkans. So it was from that paper that I started really sort of delving into the populism scholarship, which is very, very large. It's getting bigger and bigger, the scholarship. There's a lot of different approaches and understandings and theories, different ways of thinking about populism. And so I'm a relative newcomer to it, but it's something that I'm interested in. And so let me show you my screen first. I'm going to try to see if I can get this correctly. And then we'll start again. 1 second. Okay, I think you guys can all see that. So let me first start off by saying that populism, and most of the conversation will be based on this idea of authoritarian populism, but that populism is a type of politics. No one party is just populist, right? Not all populists are authoritarian or illiberal, right? You can have populists left and the right. Populism transcends geographic boundaries, okay? So let's just start off with that point first, that, we don't want to talk about this as just as a far right phenomena, but we are seeing that this current trend in populist politics is qualitatively different, and it does have sort of a far right embrace, I guess, if you want to put it that way. Whether it's Trump here in the United States, Brexit in the UK, to Marine Le Pen in France, to Viktor Orban in Hungary, to the Law and Justice Party in Poland. You're seeing an emergence of different right-wing, far-right populist parties, leaders, and movements that are transpiring right now. And so it's as a political scientist, every time we see sort of patterns like this, we get interested in it and try to explain why these things are occurring. And so that's kind of what I want to talk about a little bit. So there's a little academic exercise going on here, but I also want to paint it in a way that, this idea that is the liberal world order at stake, right? And here, this is from the Financial Times, Trump kicking the globe out of the way, and sort of, this idea that is Trump's policies and these other populist policies, is it undermining this so-called liberal world order that we've been living in since World War II? So I guess the first thing to do is sort of talk about what this liberal world order is. And as many of my students in my world politics class and international relations, we talk about this a lot when we look at the differences between the main sort of theoretical perspectives in international relations, whether it's realism or liberalism. And I kind of wanted to give you an idea of what I'm talking about the liberal world order, so because I don't want you guys to be confused with the term liberal. I'm talking more about liberal as a lowercase L than a uppercase L. And what I mean by the liberal order, I'm talking about after World War II, where democratic countries, particularly the United States and the UK, set out to create an international system that was liberal in the sense that it was based on certain international norms and practices and institutions. For instance, the idea that the international system is underpinned by some rule of law, much like how the rule of law is such an essential ingredient to democracies, domestically speaking, in our politics. The idea that the government has, certain responsibilities and functions, but it sort of can't cross certain lines, and vice versa, citizens can't cross certain lines. And so the rule of law is one of the most essential ingredients in any democracy. And if it's being violated, then your democracy is corrupt, weakened, it's on retreat if the rule of law is not being respected. Another important principle and norm or institution is the idea of respecting sovereignty and territorial integrity, right? The idea that, and this is probably the most sacrosanct institution and norm in our international law today, that was set up after World War II, and it's immersed in the UN Charter. The idea that that the internal politics of an autonomous sovereign state is to not be violated by other outside countries, that the domestic and territorial affairs should be respected by other countries. And so that was, again, a really important sacrosanct principle that's part of this liberal world order. The other international norms are human rights, the idea that we all have inalienable human rights, dignity, freedom from want, freedom from fear, basic political rights and freedoms that are enshrined into law, and that governments respect those rights and freedoms, and that's universal, right? That we all, regardless of our race, ethnicity, religion, regardless of where we are geographically around the world, we all have these universal basic rights, right? Fourth, democracy, which, the idea that we elect our leaders and can hold them accountable, right? Based on their policies and practices and behaviors. That there are certain checks and balances that limit governmental power. The importance of the media as being independent, the judiciary as being independent, a vibrant civil society that can hold government accountable from the bottom up. These are really important aspects of democracy that's part of this liberal world order that the United States and its Western liberal allies have tried to promote around the world. And then finally, free trade, right? Capitalism. And this really is based on the idea or the argument that if countries are transparent, open up their economies to one another, and allow free trade and commerce, the movement of goods and services, that in the long term, countries can learn to cooperate with one another. And that free trade is really essential for that so-called democratic or liberal peace that a lot of proponents of a liberal world order emphasize. And so there's a lot of debate about this. There's a lot of critical theorists in international relations who say, wait a minute, this liberal order never really existed. And that, countries around the world still operate based on Repolitik. They're all about, serving their national interests, prioritizing their national security, and that in the end, power always prevails over norms, right? And or ideals or values, right? But I would tend to, I see that but especially in the 1990s, after the end of the Cold War, I definitely see that the international community, through multilateral type interventions, the passing of different conventions and treaties, different types of institutions that expanded their purview, like UN peacekeeping. There was this time in the 1990s, it's a very unique period in international relations where this so-called liberal order was trying to be implemented around the world. And much of this liberal world order was being underpinned by US military strength, right? Whether it was, right after the first Persian Gulf War in 91, where the Bush administration, the first Bush administration, really was talking about a new world order, one based on some of these ideas of multilateralism, that, even though the United States was has a powerful military and a really, insurmountable economy in terms of wealth and prestige around the world, that countries around the world wanted to emulate us, right? They wanted to embrace our political system, our sort of economic system. our culture, which some people would call soft power, right? Like countries wanted to emulate us. They were gravitating towards us. We didn't have to force them to behave like us. They sort of gravitated towards us because of what we stood for and the type of institutions and politics and economics that we were practicing that seemed appealing at the time. So the 1990s was a very sort of unique period in that the United States was highly respected. Much of the former post-communist world was gravitating towards us away from Moscow. And, the United States and its Western liberal allies through the United Nations trying to guarantee peace and security, through the World Bank trying to promote economic development, to the IMF and the World Trade Organization trying to encourage free trade and investment around the world. You had this period that really highlighted a lot of the liberal order that came out of World War II and trying to implement it in practice during that time. And so, not to say that everything was perfect, and I'm not trying to romanticize it in any way, but it was something that was, in my opinion, a time where America was a leader, right? And tried to exert itself not only in terms of its power, but in terms of its values, right? And its norms. And this was a voluntary system, right? It was open to all and it was voluntary. So if countries wanted to gravitate towards this side of the spectrum, then they had to reform themselves economically and politically, embracing, democratic politics, free markets. If you wanted to join the EU, you had to do a similar thing. If you wanted to join NATO, you had to embrace these institutions and norms. And so it was an interesting time. And as someone who was studying the Balkans at the time, as many of you probably know or remember, during the 1990s, during the Yugoslav wars, as Yugoslavia was disintegrating, the United States and its European allies poured a lot of resources in the 1990s into stopping those conflicts in Bosnia and Herzegovina in the mid-1990s, and of course later on in the late 1990s with its NATO's military intervention to emancipate Kosovo away from Serbia. So, a lot of those interventions were predicated on this liberal model of trying to create multi-ethnic democracies that were underpinned by the rule of law, right? That embraced some semblance of free market economics. And so, it was a huge socio-political engineering project that the West was trying to implement in that region. So as a young grad student, I was really excited about that. And I was studying, and then all of a sudden, 9/11 happens, and then the subsequent wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, and you have the Bush administration with its sort of unilateral approach, let's just say, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, and again, authorizing those interventions in the name of democracy and human rights, and trying to promote, free markets in Central Asia and in the Middle East, in those two countries, and a lot of other countries around the world started to become a little suspect of it because it was sort of like promoting democracy through the barrel of a gun. Right? Instead of going through multilateral institutions like the UN and the EU and NATO, now America was sort of had its allies, the coalition of the willing, and using the US military as sort of a blunt instrument in trying to transfer our democratic and liberal norms into a part of the world that really never experienced that. And so that built a lot of suspicion and distrust of the United States. And one could argue that America's soft power diminished significantly after that. And since then, other countries have grown in power, like China, like India, right? Russia has become much more resurgent. since then. And so we have a lot more uncertainty as we're living more in a multipolar world, and America's power, of course, diminished significantly because of those wars. And then later on with the 2008 financial crisis, its sort of liberal economic model, its neoliberal economic model is now being highly questioned. And that then sort of puts us in the situation that we're in now, where liberalism and democracy are on the retreat, right, around the world. Those former Soviet countries that were part of, Central Eastern Europe, for instance, like Poland and Hungary, we used to put them at the top, and a lot of scholars would consider them at one point as countries that consolidated their democracies. When I mean by consolidated, I mean that democracy was the only game in town, right? That's how scholars would put that. And we thought that their institutions were robust to a certain degree and more resilient. And we're seeing now that in countries like Poland and Hungary and other countries throughout Europe, and I'll make the argument here in the United States, we're seeing democratic norms, our institutions are being weakened, right? And part of it is that there's a lot of anxiety about globalization, about demographic changes, right? Which of course leads to ethno-nationalism being on the rise, the politics of us versus them. And so that's been really damaging. And a lot of these institutions have not been resilient enough, it seems like, to handle and channel and process a lot of this conflict that we're seeing, this sort of contentious, toxic style politics, which then leads me to this idea, leads to the idea of, populist politics are on the rise. And again, I don't want to say that populist politics are inherently bad or illiberal or authoritarian. I'm not suggesting that or arguing that. But we do see a lot of politicians now in the Western world and beyond that are using populism, and on top of that, with their authoritarian tendencies, embracing more tribalist politics or ethno-nationalist style politics. And it's a very lethal, toxic combination: populism, authoritarianism, and this sort of ethno-nationalism together is leading to a very dangerous, I think, and unsettling type of politics. And as someone who cares about these type of things, I'm concerned about it. And like I said, when I talk to my colleagues in the Western Balkans, particularly my Albanian friends, because that's the population I mostly deal with in terms of my scholarship and research, a lot of them are so worried. They're like, what the heck is happening to the United States? You guys are, we rely on you. And if you're starting to go down that path, where does that put us? Especially in a place like Kosovo, whose security and economy is completely dependent on, on the European Union and on the United States. And when I talk to them, they're very worried and concerned about the political developments in our country, and it's very unsettling to them. And so here I kind of wanted to talk about, I just wanted to show you this slide that about this sort of toxic combination of populism, authoritarianism, and this type of nationalism, exclusionary nationalism, which we can talk about with other types of terms interchangeably, whereas it's xenophobia, nativism, tribalism, right? The combination of these three things, which are three very different concepts, right? Even though I've noticed in the media, they sometimes use them interchangeably. Um, but there are three different types of concept that have three different meanings from one another. And of course, within each of these concepts, there's huge debates going on about what they constitute and how we should approach them. Um, so let's talk a little bit about populism. Again, I apologize. This is kind of probably be a little bit more academic than maybe what you're used to in these lectures. Um, but I just want to remind you that populism is everywhere, right? It doesn't matter if it's from the left or the right, geographically, whether it's Prime Minister Modi in India, to Trump, to Orban, to Bolsonaro in Brazil, to Maduro in Venezuela, to Duterte in the Philippines, former president of Bolivia, Evo Morales, and in Turkey with Erdogan, and many more, right? And it's a little staggering, and we're seeing it sort of as a phenomenon, particularly since I think this has gotten a lot of attention since Brexit and since Trump's election. We see a lot of this style of politics. And populism is here to stay, right? I mean, in the American experience, we've had populism for quite some time, right? From the People's Party all the way in the 1800s with farmers protesting against the bankers, all the way to McCarthyism, right? I mean, you could talk a lot about different politicians in the 60s and 70s. And I don't want to just say that anyone is just a populist. Every politician to a certain degree engages in populist rhetoric. Even President Obama from time to time engaged in populist style rhetoric, right? And I don't want to suggest here that populism is inherently bad and that it is inherently authoritarian and illiberal. There are different types of populism there that really do focus on we the people and popular sovereignty. And there's populist movements, social movements, transnational social movements that are talking about progressive values, democracy, right, indigenous rights, right? So it's not all bad, is what I'm trying to say here. But when it comes to some of these political leaders that we'll discuss here, but mostly within the American context, given the elections around the corner, so I'll focus mostly here in the United States. It's an interesting, widespread phenomena, and like I said, it's having a devastating impact, in my opinion, on the so-called liberal world order that has been set up since World War II and implemented really in the 1990s through multilateralism and international interventionism, with the UN and the United States and other Western countries taking the lead. So I wanted to provide you a definition here that I think is good, and I want to talk about different approaches of it. But I think this is a good definition of just sort of breaking it up. At its core, populism is seen as a type of politics that reflects a deep suspicion of the prevailing establishment, right? That this establishment, in the view of most populists, does not just rule in the common good, but conspires against the people, and that the people, however defined, are the true repositories of the soul of the nation, right? So populism sort of posits sort of a vertical conceptualization of the people at the bottom and a corrupt elite, a small corrupt elite at the top, right? And those corrupt elites really don't represent the interests of the majority of the population, and that this elite, and we'll talk more about what this elite constitutes, is just that their interests are not aligned, and that they really don't represent the true intentions or how this author is saying, the soul of the nation, right? And so I like this definition or approach or idea from Cass Mudd, who wrote The Populist Zeitgeist, And he sort of sees populism sort of as an ideology or a thin ideology. The reason why he says it's a thin ideology is because it's not really a comprehensive ideology. Most ideologies not only provide critiques of the human condition and the current situation, but it also prescribes a formula or a blueprint of how to fix the system or fix the problem or how to improve the human condition, right? And so populism doesn't really do that, like Marxism or conservatism or liberalism or socialism. Those are pretty thick ideologies that not only tell you what the problem is, but they're trying to offer you a solution to the problem, right? And so populism really doesn't do that. It's just telling you what the problem is, right? And so I find this sort of conceptualization of populism interesting. Professor Mudd says that I define populism as a thin ideology that considers society to be ultimately separated into two homogeneous and antagonistic groups, right? The pure people versus the corrupt elite, and which argues that politics should be an expression of the general will of the people, right? And so here's just sort of a figure of sort of his conceptualization of populism as an ideology, right? And the elite, of course, and by the way, in his sort of conceptualization of populism, the people are sort of, both the elite and the people are homogenous groups who share similar interests. So in a way, it's kind of like they're both monolithic entities. And then, of course, you have the populist leaders who are leading the people against this corrupt elite, right? And who is this elite? Well, they can be elected politicians, parties, government officials, intellectuals and academics, technocrats and experts, economic elites, right? Multinational corporations, the media, judges, cultural elites, like writers and authors, celebrities even maybe now. They're so now actively involved as, celebrities as activists, right? And so it's an interesting group. And so the elite has sort of expanded as we live more in a globalized world. It's not just, the bankers, right? The economic elites, but it's also politicians, but it's also, technocrats and experts in Brussels that are running the European Union, right? It's also the technocrats in the World Health Organization or the WTO, right? The experts. It's Anthony Fauci, right? I mean, an epidemiologist, a preeminent epidemiologist that has, been involved in many Democratic and Republican administrations, a leading authority on pandemics, right? He is part of that sort of expert class that populists, particularly this populist in the White House, is now currently attacking, right? And so that's kind of what populism is trying to demonstrate to us, that it's sort of a vertical relationship between the masses and this small minority corrupt elite, that, and they share similar, the people have similar interests. They want popular sovereignty. They want different things we'll talk about later, whereas elites, it's about power, it's about self-interest, it's about gaining more material and political power. And so you need these populist leaders to sort of build or convey the message of the general will of the people, and define who these elites are. And that's the role of the leaders in that sort of situation. I'm going to, one of the other approaches that I find very interesting is populism as a discourse, right? The idea that if we're going to really understand populists, we need to look at how they speak, right? Their speeches, how they communicate to their crowds, right? So there's a way of how populists talk that's sort of a commonality. So I am going to stop sharing this screen and just show a short little skit from Vice that I think is pretty interesting about how populists speak, right? So 1 second, let me just.
This will be a victory for real people, a victory for ordinary people, a victory for decent people.
Je rendrai la parole au peuple. Parce qu'en démocratie, seul le peuple a raison et personne n'a raison contre lui. Je suis la candidate de la France du peuple.
Yo soy un pueblo. Así lo siento yo. Yo me siento encarnado en ustedes. You're behaving like the mafia. You think
Democracy is not about billionaires buying elections. And we will tell the billionaire class in corporate America that they will start paying their fair share of taxes.
It's either the filthy rich, the oligarchs, who continue to enjoy the perks dito sa gobyerno.
Die Menschen haben das politiek correcte von die Eliten satt. Haben sie es satt oder haben sie es nicht satt?
tilos kimondani, hogy Brüsszel ma lopakodva nyeri el nemzeti szuverenitásunk újabb és újabb szeleteit.
Whether Wall Street likes it, whether corporate America likes it, together we know what our job is. Et qui pourrait se satisfaire de ne rien faire devant un système qui nous enchaîne, qui ne fonctionne pas et pire, dont les dysfonctionnements nous ruinent?
Una sociedad que produce y reproduce la desigualdad, la exclusión, la injusticia. Por eso tenemos pobres en la patria.
When someone criticizes the elites for being corrupt, it doesn't necessarily mean the speaker is a populist. A question, how consistently do you use this pattern, whether this pattern is the major framework of your whole rhetoric.
We are transferring power from Washington, D.C., and giving it back to you, the people. We will face challenges. We will confront hardships, but we will get the job done. Politicians prospered, but the jobs left and the factories closed. Washington flourished, but the people did not share in its wealth. Mothers and children trapped in poverty in our inner cities, our young and beautiful students deprived of all knowledge. The establishment protected itself, but not the citizens of our country.
That, this idea that there's certain speech that we can sort of discern that is very populist. I think it's important that, like I said earlier, a lot of politicians, like, for instance, like Obama, will talk like a populist, but that's not the majority of the way of how he speaks to his constituents and to the United States, right? That wasn't sort of a major paradigm of how he approached his presidency. Whereas Trump I mean, he's consistently talking like a populist. He's the pronoun I alone can fix all the problems of the nation. I mean, that is really highly populist, the way that he approaches that. His attacks on the media, for instance, the enemy of the people, demonizing his political opposition, calling for Hillary Clinton or the governor of Michigan to be arrested, right? So like, there's a lot. I mean, and that's the authoritarian aspects of it, but there's also sort of that victimization that's going out there. That certain segments of the population have been ostracized or disenfranchised because of liberal elites and the coastal elites, even though Trump himself is one of those coastal elites, right? That's the part that's so fascinating about how his supporters sort of engage in that populist style politics and see him as sort of a populist leader, but not recognizing sort of that contradiction. So I think that's a really interesting way of approaching populism, is through a discourse, through conversation, through speech, right? Another one that I take in my research that I really enjoy using is seeing populism as a political style, right? So it's more than just discourse. It's more than just speech, but it's the performative aspects of populism. And one professor from Australia, Professor Benjamin Moffitt, talks about this, and this is sort of how he approaches populism, sort of the repertoires of performance that are used to create political relations. So think about a script or a template that politicians use to convey their message, both to their constituents, but also a broader audience through traditional media, but now more importantly through social media. So there's a communications aspect to this definition of populism. So I'll have Professor Moffitt sort of try to explain to you what he's talking about seeing populism as a style, right? Which I think is really important. And so I'll play this. This is very short, but I kind of wanted you guys to also see this sort of aspect of populism.
Populism. You've heard the term everywhere over the last few years. It can appear on the right, it can appear on the left, it can appear everywhere. But do you really know what it means? Populism is a political style with three main features. One, it divides society between the people and the elite.
We are participating in that democracy, and we're not going to let the billionaire class take it away from us.
Two, populists use bad manners. They act in ways we wouldn't expect from normal politicians.
You got to see this guy. I don't know what I said. I don't remember.
Three, populists promote a sense of crisis, breakdown, or threat by doing things like this.
Now we are in danger of being swamped by Muslims who bear a culture and ideology that is incompatible with our own.
Populists from across the world all draw from this exact same script, whether left, right, or centre, whether from Europe, the US, Asia, or elsewhere. So next time you hear a politician speaking about the people versus the elite, using bad manners and crisis mongering, you know you're dealing with a populist.
So I find this to be really interesting, this sort of approach to populism, where you have in a continuum, you have what Professor Moffitt just said, populist political style, which is an appeal to the people, right? Bad manners, which we can talk about, later on in our Q&A section, if you'd like. And then the idea that a crisis is around the corner, right? And then compare that diametrically opposed to sort of a technocratic political style. I think a political style that you and I are probably most accustomed to, right? And that is the idea that politicians are appealing to expertise, right? Good manners, right? Not demonizing the opposition continuously, right? And the idea that we want stability and progress and improvement in our lives rather than always talk about crisis and breakdown in our society, right? And, you know, just looking at the American context, I mean, I would think of, you know, and you might disagree with this, but I look at like people like former Congressman Paul Ryan as such a technocrat, right? And President Obama, right, as sort of providing good manners, being respectful, very much, and similar like John McCain and Mitt Romney, right? And then sort of more of the bombastic sort of crisis mongering that we see from populists like Trump or maybe even a Sarah Palin in the American context. And so I really find that conceptualization of populism as a style very helpful, particularly if you want to make a comparative analysis around the world. It allowed that sort of conceptualization allows for more comparative assessment that I think is very helpful for students and scholars who are interested in the field. And so, you know, I think those are two really interesting ways that we can sort of understand populism. Now, what I think is really toxic is the authoritarian style populism. And that is this idea that authoritarian populists favor democracy without speed bumps, right? So while they preach about the people and popular sovereignty, right, they also at the same time don't like checks and balances, right? Like, let's avoid what Congress is saying, right? Let's try to get this through without having to get the consent or the authorization of Congress, minority protections, right? And they like to appeal for more direct forms of democracy. Like Trump, you know, he relishes rallies. I mean, you can tell that as during his entire presidency, he feels so much more comfortable in a rally environment, right? He doesn't have to act like a president, right? He can joke around, dance around, you know, say inappropriate things, you know, be himself, but also show a lot of those bad manners that he couldn't do in an official stage, right? And so populists love those informal environments where they can let go, okay? And so this is a type of authoritarian populism that we're seeing. And what I'm also wanting to, and sort of end this, because I know I'm going a little bit over time, is that you know, populism alone, populist leaders, they can't thrive without a certain population embracing them. So the seeds of populism or authoritarian populism needs to have the right fertile soil, right? And there's been a lot of studies showing recently, whether it's surveys, different opinion polls and surveys that are showing that certain segments of the Republican Party have a lot of, and you see sort of certain segments and sort of an increasing anti-democratic attitudes if you look at different surveys, right? Whether they are more reluctant now to trust our institutions, our elections, the idea of using force in order to get something done, to put down instability, you know, the appeal to use of force, for instance, like with the Black Lives Matter protests and the willing to use force to put them down, the idea of taking the law into your own hands, and of course the embracement of strong leadership, authoritarian type leadership. And there are several surveys that that the Republican Party is heading a little bit in that direction. There are much more authoritarian values now within the party, and there's a lot of empirical evidence that suggests that. And that the GOP itself, the Republican Party, has become more authoritarian over time. And again, that's worrisome. In fact, I'd like to end this, my lecture, by suggesting, a lot of political scientists over time have always said that, oh, America is not going to retreat from democracy because we have institutions, right? We have robust, resilient institutions that are able to channel conflict, societal tensions, right, in a way that we can sort of address them peacefully. And we can see that sometimes politicians can undermine and discredit those institutions, right? Where people of a certain persuasion now starts seeing institutions as being illegitimate. For instance, like our elections, as more and more Americans are suspicious about the outcome of this election and are now very worried about their mail-in ballots. So that's why you're seeing a big drive to go early voting. But Trump has really cultivated that sentiment that we can't trust even our election system, our election system. So this discrediting of our institutions and weakening them. This means that maybe perhaps we can't rely on our robust, resilient institutions. And so then what's the only solution here? And a lot of it, I think, within the American context, will be on the Republican Party. What are they going to do on Wednesday morning if there is no election, a determinist election outcome, right? What happens if we don't know who the winner is on Tuesday night? And and then Trump, of course, litigates this and takes this to the courts and telling his supporters that Joe Biden and the Democrats are trying to steal this election, right? It's going to be I think the only way we're going to avert a complete constitutional crisis is if the Republican Party is like, no, we're not going with you there, right? We can't follow you there. And so that's what I'm worried about. And so, I just wanted to sort of talk about its authoritarian aspects. I wish I could talk a little bit more about some of the evidence out there about anti-democratic attitudes that are going within the country, and not only here, but around the world, particularly in Europe. But I kind of think I've gone really over time. And so I'd be more than happy to answer some questions at this point.
Well, thank you. And you did not go too long at all, Dr. Coelho. We did have a question, and I think you may have already answered or partially answered this. What is the opposite of populism?
So it's kind of, and if you want to talk about from Benjamin Moffitt's perspective, looking at it, but I think that sort of technocratic style of politics, this idea that that progress and stability, good manners, working with the other side, this idea of bipartisanship that used to be a norm, and that has slowly sort of been dismantled, and not just by one side, but both sides. But I think the Trump administration has sort of exacerbated it and added a new level to it. And again, I don't want to say that not all populists are authoritarian, not all populists are illiberal, right? Intolerant of the other, or wants and minority protections, right? But there definitely is a qualitative, you see a new qualitative side of sort of far right politics that is highly authoritarian and illiberal. And so to me, that's diametrically opposed to sort of the standard operating procedure that we've been accustomed to, which is sort of more of a technocratic style of politics, where the president, in our case, in the American context, is supposed to represent all Americans, rely on expertise, the Dr. Fauci's of the world, economists, advisors that they're surrounded by, and instead of, basing policy on intuition and emotion, you're relying on science and expertise, right? So I guess if I'm gonna have this lecture, I'd like to say that not necessarily, sort of the opposite of the type of populism that I've talked about here. That's what I would see as sort of the opposite of that.
Somebody wrote in, climate change is forcing immigration worldwide. Will this increase populism and authoritarianism in many parts of the world?
Oh, absolutely. Particularly within Europe. I mean, that has been one of the standing issues, is immigration, which has allowed a lot of populist parties in the far right to win elections legitimately and to have and gain access to power, which, you know, many of these were once fringe movements and parties that are now parties in power, not also within the European Union, and a lot of them embrace Eurosceptic policies and ideas. And so immigration definitely is one of these sources of far-right populism. And remember that President Trump, when he was going down the escalator in Trump Tower, you know, announcing his candidacy for president, I mean, that was his major issue, was immigration, right? And, you know, you can criticize him all you want, but he did have an astuteness to him where he sort of tapped in to this feeling within the country that, you know, given that we're dealing with the financial crisis in 2008, this idea of grievances within the country, any massive inequality, you know, the anxieties that come with globalization. And so I think Trump, you know, masterfully, if you want to put it that way, exploited immigration in the country, and used it to his political advantage. And because immigration is an issue that I think is, you know, it's very polarizing, very sensitive, but there's a lot of Americans out there that believe that immigrants, wrongfully, based on the data that we have here in this country, are committing more crimes than citizens, that's just not true. And that they're taking jobs from American workers, and they're bringing values or perhaps ideologies that are antithetical to the fabric of the way we've done our, you know, operated here in this country for quite some time. And so, yes, immigration is one of those issues that a lot of populists will instrumentalize and use it for their political purposes. Absolutely.
We have the question, what is the most effective way to counter or fight populism?
That is a great question. And there's a lot of debate and research out there. Again, I don't think we should portray populism as all bad. In fact, populism, given that it's based on popular sovereignty and the will of the people, right? It's inherently, I think it's inherently a democratic mechanism, right? A type of politics that that we could use for really good things and building progressive values and trying to get things done, reform the justice system, socioeconomic inequalities and injustices. I mean, populism can be used in that way, right? To highlight those issues and to try to overcome these problems. So I think with regard to far right populism, or even, you know, far left populism that is authoritarian, right? I think the best thing that we can do is to really talk about the issues and have a civil discourse. And so what I mean by that is we can't have like the first presidential debate. I mean, that's not a civil discourse. That's just going to exacerbate and make things even worse, right? But we need to sort of talk to one another and understand one another as citizens. And I know that's very difficult to do in today's time. I mean, you know, I know people who don't even talk to their relatives anymore because their relatives are Trump supporters and, you know, they support Black Lives Matter, and it's caused schisms within the family, right? And like that just shows you how damaging this polarization of our politics is. And populism, that type of politics, that style of politics, is making it worse, right? So we need politicians to sort of, be leaders, to rely on expertise. We need to vote people in that really talk about the progress of the nation as a whole rather than just segments of the population, right? And so it's a difficult enterprise. It's going to be difficult, but populism will come and go. So if Trump loses, right, that doesn't mean that populism is over, right? There are going to be politicians that are going to embrace different types of populism and engage in populist style politics. So populism is here to stay. It's not going anywhere. It's just that how the politicians use it, right? That I think will be important for the foreseeable future for our democracy.
How likely is it that the Republicans will step up as soon as Wednesday, assuming Trump wants to litigate? And I suspect this may have to do with the results that are coming in. But
yeah, I mean, it's a big question, right? It's the one that I'm worried about. I'm constantly worrying about this election. That's why I want it to be over. But then I'm thinking, oh, wait a minute. This election might not be over for weeks because we might not know the winner. And we know that both parties, both candidates have sent armies of lawyers to these swing states to litigate any sort and observing any sort of fraud that they think is taking place, any sort of electoral inconsistencies, anything that they can take into a court to show that these ballots, perhaps these mail-in ballots that are postmarked after election day, to litigate them. And so, if it's a landslide election, which I'm kind of upset about, because now I'm kind of getting the impression that the Democrats have to win by a landslide to win. Like, when did that start becoming a reality, right? But it seems that if the Democrats win by a landslide, and if Biden specifically wins by a landslide with a huge electoral count, and I think we'll know the winner if Biden wins Florida on Tuesday night. If Biden wins Florida on Tuesday night, then we don't have to worry about Pennsylvania. And I think that will say a lot about the trajectory of the election. However, if he loses Florida, because if you have to remember Pennsylvania, which is critical here, but Pennsylvania doesn't allow the mail-in ballots to be open until election day, whereas in many states they're already opening up the mail-in ballots. And remember, millions of Americans, and particularly Democrats, voted through the mail, right? So, that to me, I think will be the most worrisome aspect of the election. If Biden wins Florida, I think we'll know the sort of the direction of the election. If he doesn't, then it could take weeks. And then again, we're going to have to, I'll keep my eyes on what the Republicans are saying, what Mitch McConnell is saying, right? And it'll be interesting to see how they approach this. To be honest with you, I don't think the GOP, the conservative traditional elites, whether it's Paul Ryan, who despises Trump, right? I don't even think Mitch McConnell likes Trump, because Trump is not a conservative. He's not an ideologue. He is a transactional president. He sort of looks at his brand, his business, right? And so I think that matters more to him. And I know Mitch McConnell, and I have a feeling that Mitch McConnell and the other Republicans understand that. And so Paul Ryan is already talking about a post-Trump GOP and how they need to fix it and sort of destroy what Trump did and reform the Republican Party. So I can't give you a definitive answer, but there's definitely a lot of Republicans right now, based on my observations reading the news, that are are waiting for a post-Trump GOP. But the courts are ultimately the ones who are going to decide. And as you guys know, they have a pretty big majority in the Supreme Court.
Do you think there's now clear evidence that the right wing is trying to destroy the government from within by stripping all traditional sources of information of their legitimacy, like the FBI, the CIA, the press, and the scientists?
I don't think it's I don't necessarily think it's that much of the Republican Party itself. I think this is Trump. I think it's his allies, which some of course are hard-nosed Trumpists within the Republican Party who are anti-institutional, who dip their feet into conspiracy theories. They believe, whether sincerely or not, I don't know, that there's a deep state and that the FBI and the intelligence agencies are part of this so-called deep state. And I have to be honest with you, as someone who studied deep state politics in Turkey and in Egypt, where literally family members were appointed to important, prominent positions in those countries. And, that's what a deep state is when, the kin and the family network of these powerful leaders are, their tentacles are spread within every institution of the state. I just don't see that in the United States, right? And so there has been Trump elements that have been undermining these institutions, calling out the FBI, the CIA, and different intelligence agencies within the government, trying to discredit them and delegitimize them if they come out with reports that are, not flattering to the president. And so that I'm worried about that. I am very worried about that. I'm worried about the politicization of the State Department. When I talk to my foreign colleagues, they always talked about how the State Department was one of the most important institutions in terms of promoting that liberal world order I alluded to earlier, about promoting democracy and human rights and building, alliances with, leaders and different parties within different countries. A lot of them say that they don't see that anymore within the diplomatic corps of the United States. And I'm very worried about how Mike Pompeo, who is a Trumpist, has really sort of politicized that agency and institution. And so, yeah, there's a lot of that. There's a lot, if Biden wins, there's a lot that has to be rebuilt, right? And it's going to take a while. And if he wins, Trump, then we're talking about, decades of having to rebuild those institutions and their credibility and legitimacy. I mean, it's gonna. I'm really worried about that. So, I think I addressed that question. I hope I did.
I have a long question here. Maybe I can take part of it. Someone writing in about being concerned about the backlash of populism. The people who do like Trump are shunned, and concerns about that we're becoming socialist.
Yeah, I mean, I look at a lot of part of my research is I've been studying a lot about violent extremism. Not just in the United States, but in different parts of the world, particularly Islamist sort of extremism, violent extremism in the Balkans. But I look at, some of the groups that are operating within the United States right now, and our intelligence agencies, and the FBI director says that white nationalists, violent extremist groups are some of the biggest threats now to U.S. national security. And a lot of them, if you listen to or read about them, whether, the Oath Keepers, Proud Boys, other types of far-right white nationalist organizations, and many of them are very different from one another, but a lot of their ideologies overlap too with one another. So I would never treat them as a monolithic group of people. Some are more about, Second Amendment rights. anti-government, more of a libertarian bent, while others are civilizationalists. They're more worried about Western Judeo-Christian civilization being threatened by, Islamists or Islam as a religion, Hispanics, or different non-Western cultures coming into the country. So there's a bunch of these groups, and they have overlapping ideologies, but they also have their own independent ideas from one another, disparate ideas of of goals and ideologies from one another. And so, I think it's very worrisome. And, our intelligence agencies are telling us this is a big problem. I remember when the Obama administration tried to raise this issue, and I think his first term, he tried to raise this issue, and the Republican Congress, the committee, did not want to even hear about it, because they feel like it provides justification to, create a surveillance regime over not just right-wing extremist groups, but just right-wing groups in general, including far-right groups. And so, to me, that is very disconcerting. I hope that a Biden administration will, try to tackle the problem a little bit more thoroughly than this previous administration and the administration before Trump. And so seeing this problem as growing, it's getting bigger. And a lot of it is about grievances. It's about the idea that, America is losing itself. It's losing its soul. That it's about the demographic reality that, white Caucasians will eventually be a minority, whereas together, Blacks, Hispanics, Asians, together, and so that demographic reality, combined with authoritarian populism, is unsettling, to say the least. And so I think, and so, by the way, Trump speaks directly to their concerns, and so a lot of these white nationalist far right groups, they were never fans of the Bush administration, right? Because the Bushes were sort of elite Republicans that were engaging in foreign ventures and conflicts abroad. They're fiscal conservatives, even though some of them are, talk about, socialism and Marxism as being a threat to American way of life. They never saw traditional Republicans like Mitt Romney, like Bush, as being allies, but they definitely see an ally in this president. This president speaks to them, whether directly or indirectly, through gaslighting, through different types of ways. He's their man, right? And so I think it's really worrisome. If he loses, what's going to happen afterwards? Is there going to be violence? Are these groups going to engage in violent extremism or terrorism? That's something that we have to look at and be, I think, conscientious of.
We have two more questions. Is that okay? Or
yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Policy works by appeals to reason and science. Populism works by appeal to emotions. We know which works best. Please comment.
Absolutely. Populism does hit emotions, and politicians who are as masterful as Trump. I mean, Trump is a TV reality star. He's a media mogul. Like, he knows what he's doing, right? He knows how to tap into those inner sort of insecurities that I think resonate with some Americans, right? Or a large segment of the population, right? So to him, he's really good at doing that. And so populism is a perfect mechanism. It's a perfect style of politics to sort of exploit those things. And I really believe that President Trump really knows what he's doing. I mean, he might not call himself a populist or even know what I'm talking about when I talk about populism, but I really think that he is using, whether he knows what populism is or not, he definitely knows what he's doing, the mechanisms of populism, the strategies of populism. He's really using them to his advantage and sort of to tap into those insecurities that certain segments of the American population are feeling. Absolutely.
Okay, and one last question or comment. I guess, do you see parallels between the way Trump and his surrogates are communicating, taking away minority rights, dividing people, steering fear, and so on? Do you see a relationship with that and what happened in Germany in the 1930s? And why aren't people recognizing that?
Yeah, well, okay. So when I think of the authoritarian populism that has completely destroyed democracy, I think of someone like President Erdogan in Turkey. I mean, you have to remember, Turkey in the 2000s was considered the bridge between the East and the West, and it was an exemplar of an Islamic country embracing democracy in its institutions and norms and values, right? And then gradually and very slowly and incrementally, Erdogan started to dismantle the democratic institutions, norms, and practices in Turkey. He did this by imprisoning political opposition, right? Which has not happened here, even though Trump and his surrogates and his allies and his fans or his supporters have talked about politicians, right? That hasn't happened. But in Turkey, it did. It is happening, and it's happening right now, right? Erdogan has basically destroyed independent media and journalism, right? By locking up any journalist who criticizes his administration, his policies. Whereas in here, Trump has not gone that far. Obviously, he criticizes the media. He demonizes the media, right? He delegitimizes it by, saying that's fake news. But he hasn't gone and arrested journalists. I don't think he has, right? And so Erdogan has taken authoritarian populism to that level where Turkey is no longer a liberal democracy anymore. It is an authoritarian regime, right? I don't see that Trump has taken us that far, but Trump has taken us in that trajectory, right? He has dismantled a lot of democratic norms. Now remember, like for instance, using the White House as a campaign prop. That's breaking a democratic norm. No president has really, to the extent that he has, used the White House as a campaign prop, right? Mike Pompeo showing up at the Republican National Convention and giving a speech in support of Trump. Like, no Secretary of State has done that. But then again, that's a violation of a democratic norm. So it's not necessarily breaking the law, but it's breaking norms and practices that we deem to be legitimate, right? And he's unraveling them. He's weakening them, right? And that could lead to that step where our institutions and our democracy as we know it is just stripped away right below our feet, right? And I wish I could have gone more into this. And I showed you just one slide, but there is a small segment of the Republican Party and its supporters that are increasingly becoming more anti-democratic in their attitudes, right? The idea that, that we should be embracing strong leaders, kind of like how the Russians embrace a really strong Vladimir Putin, right? That, the media is all fake unless it's the media that they read or watch on TV. Any criticism of Trump is not real. It's fake news, right? I mean, police using force against protesters. You see a larger part of the Republican constituents now saying that maybe that's an appropriate way how to deal with social instability on the streets, and so you do see that, and so I don't think we're anywhere near what Germany was and during the interwar period, which led to the rise of fascism and Nazism. Yes, there are some fascist qualities, I guess you could say, that some politicians have, but I don't think we're there at that stage. What I am concerned is that our democratic norms are being undermined, and that could then lead to the denigration of our institutions. And that part I'm worried about, because that could lead us further to what Erdogan has done in Turkey. Absolutely.